Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am proud to rise in this House to speak to my private member's bill, Bill C-245, a bill which amends the Act of the Infrastructure Bank of Canada, a bill that uses public ownership in the fight against climate change, a bill that gives hope to communities like the one I come from, communities like the ones I represent, communities across our country that are already paying the price of climate change. Ce projet de loi offrirait une nouvelle avenue aux communautés autochtones, aux communautés du Nord et à tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes pour développer les infrastructures dont on a besoin maintenant. La crise climatique est à nos portes. Les témoignages qu'on entend chez nous, au Nord, sont alarmants. Le pergélisol fond et met à risque nos infrastructures municipales. La saison d'hiver des routes temporaires dont dépendent des milliers de personnes pour la livraison du matériel lourd est de plus en plus courte. Il faut qu'on donne des moyens à ces communautés pour faire face au changement climatique avant qu'il ne soit trop tard. En même temps, la Banque d'infrastructure du Canada a échoué. Aucun projet n'a encore été livré et des milliards dorment dans ses coffres. Le temps presse, comme l'a dit le secrétaire général des Nations Unies cette semaine. Le temps est venu de prendre tous les outils à nos dispositions et les mettre au service de la lutte contre la crise climatique. Le projet de loi que je vous propose aujourd'hui fait partie de la solution. This past September, I sat with the Chief and Council of Pangasi First Nation at the hotel in Winnipeg where they were evacuated. They were into the third month of their forced evacuation from wildfires raging in eastern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. This was their third evacuation in 4 years. This time, it lasted 4 months. We sat in one of the hotel meeting spaces that had been converted into a makeshift school. The leaders and principal of the school shared their concerns. These fires are only getting worse, they shared. We need support to keep our communities safe, they said. Pangasi is one of 2 First Nations in Manitoba that, despite years of advocacy, doesn't even have an airport. No all-weather road, no airport. We felt trapped, they said. Pangasi lost community members during the time of the evacuation. Many community members were desperate to go home, and when they got home, they found hectares of their traditional lands devastated, trap lines gone, cabins burned to the ground, a way of life under threat. This summer saw a series of devastating climate events. Perhaps one that received the most attention was the burning to the ground of Lytton in British Columbia. The excruciatingly high temperatures of the heat dome created the conditions of a fire that engulfed a village, a community, lives, and livelihoods. As Edith Lauren Kahanga, school administrator for Stein Valley Lakamu School in Lytton said, the extreme temperatures of 49 degrees plus leading up to June 30th contributed to the Lytton Creek fire that destroyed the village of Lytton in 25 minutes and burned many homes and businesses on IR-17, 18, and 22 of Lytton First Nation in the Thompson-Nicola Regional District. Our lives were forever changed on June 30th. 9 months later, those who lost their homes continue to be homeless and struggle with high anxiety and PTSD as they continue to reconnect with their families, culture, way of life, and the land. And to this day, Lytton is still waiting to be cleaned up and rebuilt. Pangasi, Lytton, Little Grand Rapids, St. Teresa Point, Shamattawa, Thompson, Iqaluit, Old Crow, The Pas, Fort Chipewyan, Prince George, Penemutang, Peguis, Inuvik, Uashet Milyotanan, Happy Valley, Goose Bay. This bill is for all our communities. Communities that have been sounding the alarm of climate change for some time, have been clear on what they need and what we need to mitigate and adapt. Communities that have been ignored. This must change. Time is running out. Just this week, the IPCC came out with a damning report highlighting the absolute urgency needed to fight climate change. The report outlined the need to ditch fossil fuels. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described the report, but just as easily could have been talking about the Liberal government record on climate change as a, quote, litany of broken promises, a file of shame cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world. The jury has reached a verdict, and it's damning. We are on a fast track to climate disaster, he said. There's been many reports and many words, but not enough action. The Liberals continue to maintain the anti-science fallacy that fossil fuel investments will pay for a clean energy transition. This government has given more to oil companies than even the previous Conservative government could have dreamed of. We're shamefully the worst G7 country when it comes to GHG emissions. And at a time where we should be supporting the transition to green energy, dozens of northern communities in our country are running on dirty diesel. Time is running out. We must act now. It is time we commit to investing in Indigenous and Northern communities and all our communities in supporting their efforts for a just transition by supporting this legislation. Because it is that important. The infrastructure needs are that important. A recent report claimed that the infrastructure gap for First Nations is conservatively estimated at $25 to $30 billion. Yet many of the infrastructure needs we see are for projects between $1 and $25 million. Bluntly speaking, slapping a profit requirement on infrastructure bank projects locks communities like the ones I represent out of these dollars. Do their infrastructure needs not matter? Chief Owens of Pungassi First Nation said, "We have already seen the effects of climate change over the last few decades. It is real. I was surprised in conversations with Niki to even hear of Canada's infrastructure bank. We've never heard of it. We've never been able to use it. Investments to connect us with the rest of the country or help us deal with fires we would like to see, and this bill would help with that." Chief Redhead from Shamattawa First Nation, a community that's been failed by Canada time and time again, that deals with massive infrastructure gaps, a housing crisis, tuberculosis outbreaks as a result of the housing crisis, and a recent COVID outbreak that was so bad the military had to be sent in. With regards to this bill, he said, one of the benefits of seeing this bill pass would be the ability to connect Shamattawa to the main hydro line. Right now, we're dependent on burning dirty diesel for the entire community. It's 2022, and it's time to bring communities like Shamattawa into 2022. I'd really like to see this bill pass and for all parties to support it so we can make real change in the fight against climate change. Chief Flett of St. Teresa Point has talked about the need for an all-weather road system to the Island Lake region, given the melting ice roads and the chance to cut down on the carbon footprint that comes from an absolute reliance on air travel. We've heard from leaders about water pipes breaking down in their communities because of melting permafrost, radio towers snapping because of the weight of record snowfalls, historic droughts, unpredictable flooding. In discussions with Indigenous, territorial, and Northern leaders, we repeatedly heard about how they want to move forward with mitigation and adaptation. We also heard how hard it was for them to access any federal dollars. Overwhelmingly, there was a sense that the federal government existed to serve the needs of the southern part of the country, if that. In conversations with some of my Liberal colleagues in advance of today, I heard concerns that there are other federal institutions that can do this work, that can fund these types of projects. But the reality is, they aren't. That's why so many of these communities are in such dire straits. If we acknowledge the need is great, if we acknowledge current institutions aren't getting the job done, why don't we use Canada's infrastructure bank to do the job we originally wanted it to do? We can't afford to wait in terms of climate, and we certainly cannot afford to wait when it comes to people. If not now, when? It is clear Canada's infrastructure bank is not living up to its promise. We're talking about a crown corporation with a budget of $35 billion that has yet to complete a single project in almost 5 years of existence. A recent PBO report said it won't even spend half its money. In the Infrastructure Committee study called for by my colleague, the MP for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, witness after witness made clear that the bank in its current form does not and cannot work. Yet when the bank was first established, many folks were excited. Robert Ramsey, the senior research officer at CUPE, described the excitement when they thought that they were hearing about the creation of a public infrastructure bank that could invest in desperately needed infrastructure across the country. This has not been the case. The reality is the bank is refusing to do the work it promised to do. At committee, the PBO reported that the Canada Infrastructure Bank had only approved 18% of projects it considered, with one of the most common reasons given for rejection being the projects themselves weren't considered big enough. This bill would fix that. It would prioritize the infrastructure needs of the communities the bank claims to be working for. The bank's privatization agenda has been a key part of the problem. There was a consistent feature of testimony in committee from witnesses, including Canadians for Tax Fairness, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and the Council of Canadians, who argued that public-private partnerships, and particularly ones which include private operators collecting revenue through user fees, inherently raise questions about which projects are selected. They questioned whether Canadians can be satisfied that an infrastructure project is being funded because it serves the greatest public interest and not because it offers the highest rate of return for private equity providers. As Mr. Sanger testified, the only purpose that P3s fill is to engage in some off-book financing and provide private finance with lucrative, low-risk investment opportunities that taxpayers will cover for decades to come. If these projects are really privatized, we will undoubtedly end up with some really inadequate infrastructure. In Mapleton, Ontario, it took public outrage to stop the Infrastructure Bank from privatizing water services. As Angela McEwen, senior economist at QP, said, the most critical infrastructure needs in Canada aren't ones that work with a profit attached to them. It's basic infrastructure that communities need to go about their daily lives. It should be publicly financed and publicly owned so it benefits the most people. I'm really excited to see this bill. This is what we've been asking for at QP and the broader Labour movement, for the bank to move in this direction. Along with its privatization agenda, there's a lack of transparency from the bank. Yves Giroux, the parliamentary budget officer at committee, discussed the bank's refusal to share information, saying that the bank was probably less transparent than the Department of Infrastructure. He also pointed out that parliamentarians had yet to receive a full status update on the bank, because the government has not kept track of information on all funded projects. This is obviously unacceptable. We are also calling through this bill on the bank to include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis voices in its governance. If we acknowledge that the greatest infrastructure gap in the country is within these communities, it is frankly inconceivable that in 2022, and in the age of reconciliation, that these communities don't have a say in what's happening on their land. It is clear the foundations of the Canada Infrastructure Bank must be rebuilt. We can do this work. We know that the fight against climate change requires bold collective action. It requires the leveraging of public investment in historic ways. Crown corporations are key tools in this fight. Our crown corporations that belong to us, the Canadian people, ought to be leading players in the fight against climate change. Today, we can start with the Infrastructure Bank. The Infrastructure Bank can be the solution and not a tepid part of the problem. I urge my Liberal colleagues, and indeed all members of this House, to be part of that solution. The bank should be issuing green bonds, as many have called for. Let's let the CIB be a driving force in the fight against climate change, in the fight against the Infrastructure Bank our communities face. Au lieu de mettre des fonds publics au service du secteur privé qui va prioriser le profit, mettons-les au service des communautés qui luttent pour leur survie en pleine urgence climatique. Utilisons les pleins leviers de l'État et mettons-le au service des gens. Créons des emplois verts. Allions-nous aux peuples autochtones qui sont aux premières loges de la crise climatique. Allons trouver tous les organes sous-performants de l'État, comme la Banque d'infrastructure. On l'a besoin pour la survie de notre planète. My message to Liberals is clear. If you want the Infrastructure Bank to live up to its promise, make these changes. My message to all MPs in this House is clear. If you believe communities across our country deserve federal investment as they take on the climate crisis, vote for this bill. If you believe we need bold action to take on the climate emergency, vote for this bill. Thank you.